Well, this is part 2 of the last video in our series, Where Did the Bible Come From? And we ended the last video with an introduction to the King James Version. And what I want to do in this video, and as we finish the series, Where Did the Bible Come From? I wanted to look at the history of the King James Version, and look at a few of its weaknesses where I'm sure I'm going to tread on a few people's toes, but I'm doing it for the sake of truth. So if you're ready, let's continue. So the history of the King James Version is this. In 1604, King James I summoned a meeting of representatives from diverse religious groups to discuss the issue of religious toleration. At this meeting, known as the Hampton Court Conference, Dr. John Reynolds of Oxford discussed the desirability of having an authorised version of the English Bible that would be acceptable to all parties within the church. Now, the king agreed with Reynolds and called for a version that could be used for both private and public use. Now, according to James, the scholars involved with the new version were to use the bishop's Bible as the basic version as long as it adhered to the original Greek and Hebrew. They would also consult the other translations, Tyndale, Matthew, Coverdale, the Great Bible and the Geneva Bible. Now, unlike previous versions, there were to be no notes of comment except for what was essential in translating the text. In 1607, the translation formally began. 54 men skilled in Greek and Hebrew were selected and divided into 6 working companies, 2 at Westminster, 2 at Oxford, and 2 at Cambridge. Each group was given detailed instructions and was assigned selected books to be translated. The work of each group was to be examined by the other companies. So this translation was to be the work of the revisers as a whole, not the work of one person or group. The work continued for 2 years and 9 months. Now, in 1611, the first copies of the new version were printed. It was dedicated to the king, and on its title page were the words, "Appointed to be read in the churches." Now, in 1613, a new edition was issued with more than 400 variations from the original printing. Numerous other changes have taken place in the centuries that followed. The King James immediately replaced the Bishop's Bible in the churches, but still received stiff competition from the popular Geneva Bible. Within a few decades, though, the King James Version established itself as the standard for English-speaking people around the world. Now, what are the reasons for the success of the King James Version? Well, there's 4. Number 1, Greek and Hebrew scholarship had made great strides from the time of Tyndale's translation. Secondly, the King James Version was made at a time when literary scholarship was flourishing. Thirdly, the King James Version translators were able to learn from the other translations before the King James Version. And fourthly, the King James Version was not the work of one man or group. So then there was revisions to the King James Version. Now, the King James Version, has to be said, has been through many editions and has been modernized quite a lot since 1613. In 1611, In 1613, a new edition was issued which contained more than 400 variations from the original printing, as I said a minute ago. Now, other revisions took place in 1615, 1629, 1638 and 1762. the 1762 revision is what most people now know as the King James Version of the Bible. So let's look at the popularity of the King James Version. The King James Version remains the most popular English Bible ever. Its classic language, though difficult for some to understand today, has been communicating the will of God for over 3.5 centuries. Its majestic style has been quoted, paraphrased, and imitated like no other. Its influence in Christian hymns is unmistakable. Now, although recent textual developments have shown some weaknesses, the King James Version will likely remain the most popular English translation for many years to come. Now, I just mentioned there are some weaknesses to the King James Version. Now, I'm going to tread on a few toes here, but for the sake of truth. Now, the weaknesses of the King James Version revealed the need for more recent translations. The King James Version of the Bible is based, or was based, on the best Greek and Hebrew text available at the time. This contributed immeasurably to its worth, because most English Bibles had been translated from a Latin translation. Thus, the King James Version took English readers a full step closer to the original message. But that was over 350 years ago. Archaeology has contributed much to biblical studies since that time, and textual criticism has made some significant advances since then as well. So let's have a balanced view of the weaknesses. When discussing the weaknesses of the King James Version, a word of caution is necessary. The differences between the King James Version and more recent versions were very minor. The King James Version is an excellent version and clearly reveals the will and purposes of God. Now, what are the weaknesses of the King James Version? The following weaknesses I'm just about to talk about do show a need for more revised versions of the Bible. Now, the King James Version is founded on an inferior textual base. The manuscript evidence available to the King James translators was not as good as the manuscript evidence we have today. This is especially true with reference to the Greek text for the New Testament. The text underlying the King James Version, which is what we know as the Textus Receptus, was essentially a medieval text embodying a number of scribal mistakes that had accumulated through the years. Let's talk about the history of the Textus Receptus. Now, in 1516, Desiderius Erasmus published a Greek text which came to be known as the Textus Receptus. This served as the basic guide for the translators of the King James Version. Now, being an excellent scholar, Erasmus printed a fine text, but he was only able to gather half a dozen Greek manuscripts for his initial work. Plus, the Greek manuscripts used in the Textus Receptus were from the inferior text type known as Byzantine. Now, the Byzantine text type represents a revision of the New Testament text made in the 4th century AD and later. It is also farther removed from the text of the 1st century than certain earlier text types which have been discovered in more recent times. So let's just say this, that the revisers of the 1611 King James Version used the best textual evidence they had available to them. That means they are not at fault here. They simply did not have at their disposal the many manuscripts which are now known. So it is important to remember that 4 of the most valuable witnesses on the New Testament text, that is the Vaticanus Codex, the Sinaitic Codex, the Alexandrian Codex, and the Ephraim manuscripts were not available when the King James translation was made, nor were there accessible to the translators many other important manuscripts, including the very early papyrus documents. So, the King James Version, wonderful version, but it has its weaknesses. And today we have other translations, other revisions of the Bible. We're going to have a look at those now. So, with the discovery of earlier and better manuscript evidence, the time had come for updated versions of the English Bible. And some of these are the English Revised Version from 1885. Then there's the American Standard Version from 1901, the Revised Standard Version from 1952, the New English Bible from 1961, the Good News Bible from 1966, the Living Bible from 1971, the New American Standard Bible from 1971, and the New International Version from 1979. Now, from 1982, we had the New King James Version, which really came from an issue of the King James Version New Testament done by Thomas Nelson Publishers in 1979. Now, this edition was based on the 1894 edition of the Textus Receptus. Now, while it preserved the integrity of the text, it eliminated many archaic expressions that made the old King James Version difficult to read. The publisher assembled 119 scholars to work on this new publication. Dr. Arthur Farstead coordinated the work on the New Testament section. This is what he said: "We chose to follow the same theory of manuscript selection as was employed by the 1611 translators." So, as I said, in 1982, Thomas Nelson published the complete New King James Version of the Bible, which quickly gained wide acceptance. Now, that's the version of the Bible that I read. Now, the era of revisions, the late 20th century, the 1980s and 1990s, seem to be a time for new revisions, not new translations. We don't need a new translation. The Bible has been translated into English from the original Greek, from the original Hebrew, from the original Aramaic. We do have the true Word of God, the error-free, inspired Word of God, and that is where the Bible came from. So we've gone from right from the start to right at the end, so you can have confidence that the Bible you hold in your hands today is the true Word of God. So I want to thank you for joining me in this series. It's been a great series to do, and look forward to seeing you in another series. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.